If I asked you, what does the world of Harry Potter look like? What would you think of? Maybe this, or this, or this. The on-screen world of Harry Potter has a distinct visual identity, but it owes a lot of its magic to real historical styles of art, architecture, and design. Harry Potter's eclectic collage of architectural, interior, and costume design from many different historical periods creates a timeless yet unmistakably British aesthetic. In fact, I believe that the success of the Harry Potter franchise can in part be attributed to the film's captivatingly nostalgic aesthetic. But I think one of the most powerful aspects of the screen adaptations is the way the films utilise cultural and political references to European history. And the reason these aesthetic choices are so powerful is because to most viewers, the political ideas and emotions they evoke are received unconsciously. In this video essay, I will be exploring how the political world of Harry Potter is represented on screen, and the specific historical cultural references that are used to explore both the politics of the wizarding world and our own. Before we begin, I'd like to say that I think it would be wrong to make a video essay analysis about the politics of Harry Potter without acknowledging the ongoing political context of the books and their author. Even though this essay will be focusing mainly on the films of the Harry Potter series and their production design, I fully acknowledge that the creator of the franchise has in recent months been using her platform to influence political discourse. I do not support J.K. Rowling's views on trans people. Trans women are women, end of story. It is obvious that the Harry Potter series draws from many well-established traditions of the fantasy genre. There are witches, wizards, elves, goblins, mermaids, centaurs, and many other magical creatures. J.K. Rowling also drew inspiration from historical sources that reference magic and witchcraft, and included references to things like mandrakes, witch burnings, and 14th century alchemist Nicholas Flamel. But the settings of the Harry Potter universe are much more grounded in reality. A train, a castle, a village, a shopping strip, a bus, a pub. Although many of these places have been given magical properties, it's primarily their old world charm that gives them their sense of magic. Making timeless fantasy films is not an easy task, especially with a story with its roots in the modern world. Well, technically the 90s, although that's not that modern anymore. To help with this, the Harry Potter films show very little digital technology, and what muggle media and technology they do show is simplified and dated back to make it already feel kind of retro. Other fantasy franchises that have been successful in remaining visually timeless are ones set firmly in a fantasy version of the past or the distant future. This is because the present dates too quickly. The parts of Harry Potter that will likely date are its occasional cues to the 2000s, like Harry's hoodies or some of Hermione's god-awful shoes. Or this shot. But to build a timeless aesthetic, you have to use actual historical styles and designs, and every historical style comes with baggage. There is, in the popular imagination, an idea about what certain parts of history looked like and what they represent. Now, the popular imagination is not well known for historical accuracy, and neither is Hollywood. But with fantasy, there's no need or expectation to be historically accurate. The filmmakers get to have fun and play with different historical references. But good filmmakers will know that it's not just a matter of picking and choosing whatever styles you like the look of. It's also a matter of choosing the styles that already mean something to the audience and capitalizing on those preconceptions for maximum effect. So, what is the meaning of the fantasy historical aesthetic of Harry Potter? Well, before we can define what the aesthetic of magic is, we must first define what it is not. Before we're introduced to the wizarding world, we have the pleasure of meeting Mr. and Mrs. Dursley of number 4 Privet Drive, Little Whinging, Surrey. Privet Drive and the Dursleys' home plays a pivotal role in contrasting the world Harry grows up in to the wondrous wizarding world. Ideologically, the aesthetic of the Dursleys and number 4 Privet Drive is all about the uniformity of suburbia and the aspirational middle class. Everything in the Dursleys' home, from the wallpaper to the glassware, pretends to be old-worldy, but is entirely manufactured. The Dursleys' home is full of dark timber furniture, but it's not antique, it's veneer reproduction. The copious number of family photos, none of which include Harry, are like a shrine to successful family life, and the pastels and florals of the curtains and tableware, wallpaper and furniture display a saccharine yet stifling faux sentimentality. The Dursleys' middle-class aspiration for the prestige of old money is also showcased in the deleted scene where Dudley is trying on his new school uniform for the private school he will be attending next year. Aunt Petunia scoffs when Harry asks her if he will have to wear the uniform too. She says Harry will be going to the state school, where he belongs, which is ironic because Harry ends up attending an elite private school himself. The Dursleys are a family who are so desperate to be seen as normal. Their home reflects a conservative 1950s style vision of domestic bliss. This outwardly perfect middle-class family is poisoned by their contempt for their unwanted fourth member, and the fear that anyone might find out that they're less than normal. Number 4 Privet Drive is middle-class suburbia pushed so far it borders on the grotesque. This aesthetic represents an exaggerated image of an ideology common to middle-class Britain: material aspiration, aggressive conformity, and a fear of difference that often tips over into outright loathing. The theme of suburban conformity is reflected in the exterior of Privet Drive, which is a row of identical houses, each with the same make and model of car in the driveway. In the first film, the filmmakers used a real street in an outer London housing development called Martin's Heron, built in the 1980s. And for the later films, they recreated this street at Leavesden Studios. This suburb is a particularly interesting choice because it not only carries the manufactured sterility that most pre-planned suburbs have, but also the architecture of this suburb falls under the category of the mock Tudor trend of the late 70s and 80s, showcased particularly in the diamond-paned windows and pitched roofs. Now, the Tudor period was way back in the 16th century when the Tudor monarchs ruled England, but there have been several waves of Tudor revivalist architecture since the late 19th century in particular. A key feature of the Tudor style were exposed timber beams, often in a cross formation. Mock Tudor buildings try to replicate this design, but instead of using actual timber beams for construction, they just slap them on the facade as superficial decoration. While Number 4 Privet Drive doesn't have any of these fake beams, many other houses in the Martin's Heron housing estate do. I find this really interesting because Mock Tudor is a particularly superficial style of architecture. Like the Dursleys themselves, Mock Tudor often imitates old-timey prestige that ends up creating a domesticated and, quite frankly, tacky suburban nightmare. Other sets in the Harry Potter series reference Tudor architecture, but those sets are designed to look authentic, like actually old, while the Dursley suburb of manicured lawns is coded as nouveau riche kitsch, and it is this visual contrast that serves the film's narrative. The Dursleys, with their aspirational middle-class values and
traditional moral values,
are as far from the wizarding world as you could get. In many ways, they remind us of everywhere we supposedly went wrong in the 20th century, or at the very least, they refuse to allow us any nostalgia for suburbia or conformity. So when it's time for us to be introduced to the wizarding world, we're in desperate need of a visual and moral palate cleanser. We are ready to step back in time. Hold up, let's not get too far ahead of ourselves. All in good time. Although Hogwarts is probably the most iconic and recognisable set of the Harry Potter series, I would argue that the historically inspired visual identity of the wizarding world is set well before we even see Hogwarts. Our introduction to the wizarding world is Harry's first visit to the Leaky Cauldron and Diagon Alley. It is in these scenes that we're first introduced to the styles of clothing, architecture, and props that will be the foundations for the aesthetics of the rest of the series. When Harry and Hagrid step off the streets of London and into the Leaky Cauldron, it immediately feels as though we've travelled back in time. The dingy, candlelit pub with its mortared walls is evocative of a vague imagining of the medieval period, and the clothing of the patrons is a mixture of Edwardian top hats, Victorian bonnets, and yes, turbans on white guys. This historically inspired aesthetic is consolidated and expanded in the next scene in Diagon Alley. The streetscape of Diagon Alley is a wizard version of the Tudor shambles in York, with crooked, overhanging upper stories overlooking a crowded pedestrian market. The shop fronts and marketing material combine this medieval look with some 19th century styles, especially the large multi-paned shop windows and the timber interiors of Ollivander's wand shop. The overall effect of Diagon Alley is one of warmth, excitement, and nostalgia for an imaginary pre-industrial past. A cash economy of small businesses, local community, and a simpler way of life. The timelessness of Diagon Alley gives the wizarding world both an implied history, as in it looks like it's been there forever, but also an implied permanency, which is key to the enduring charm of the Harry Potter franchise. The next hit of imagined nostalgia comes in the form of a Great Western Railway 4900 Class 5972 Alton Hall steam engine, aka the Hogwarts Express. This train was actually made in 1937 and the interiors of the Hogwarts Express are very mid-century, but the combination of the steam engine and the Glenfinnan viaduct gives the Hogwarts Express a sense of being much older, especially since most people associate steam engines with the 19th century. After the Hogwarts Express, we arrive, of course, at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, surely the most iconic location of the film franchise. The Hogwarts Castle is a mix of various styles of historical castle, but the most dominant is the Gothic style. Gothic architecture began in the middle to late 12th century and its popularity lasted well into the 16th. The main features of the Gothic style are pointed arches, ornate vaulted ceilings, and large stained glass windows. These design elements came about because architects wanted to build taller cathedrals with higher ceilings. They found that a pointed arch could support much more weight than the previous Romanesque rounded arches, and they also invented flying buttresses which would support a cathedral's weight from the outside. One of the sets used in the Chamber of Secrets was the cloisters at Gloucester Cathedral, which are a beautiful example of this style of architecture. The Gothic style not only gives the castle a sense of age, but also creates a sense of prestige and mystery. The medieval Gothic style coincided with the creation of the first universities in Europe, which is why we often associate this aesthetic with things like education, scholasticism, institutional importance, and exclusivity. But the Gothic style is also the one we most often associate with witchcraft, magic, and spooky things like Halloween. And this is because of a very influential artistic, literary, and architectural movement of the 19th century, Neo-Gothic. Neo-Gothic essentially does what it says on the tin. It was a revival of Gothic style, starting in the late 18th century and popularised throughout the 19th century. Heaps of churches, as well as many public buildings and institutions, were built in the Neo-Gothic style. In fact, if you live in an ex-British colony like Australia, a lot of our early universities and cathedrals were built in the Neo-Gothic style. 19th century Neo-Gothic was essentially a stylistic approach to imagining a golden era of the European Middle Ages. Parallel to Neo-Gothic architecture was Gothic literature, a romanticisation of pre-industrial Europe and its aristocratic traditions. Common themes of this whole Neo-Gothic moment were nostalgia, mystery, and of course, magic and the supernatural. The Neo-Gothic has influenced the fantasy genre more than any other style, and so it's only fitting that it should be one of the main styles of the Harry Potter film series. Something that's commonly noted about the Harry Potter series is how the films become darker over time, and quite literally. The colours become darker, the lighting dimmer, and overall the colour grade becomes tinged with this blue-grey. This darkening colour palette reflects the themes of the films becoming darker and the rising stakes of the narrative. The tonal shift, especially between the second and third films, is unmistakable from the colour palette, but I would argue that it's more than just colour palette and lighting that indicate a tonal shift in the series, especially when it comes to the political subplot, which gains increasing traction as the series progresses. From the third film onwards, there is the gradual introduction of some very specific 20th century aesthetics. And at the height of the political drama subplot of the series, we're introduced to what I think is one of the most effective uses of historical art and design in this film franchise. The main plot of the series can be described as Dark Wizard Voldemort gains power, tries to take over the wizarding world, and young Harry Potter must stop him. But supporting this main plot, especially in the second half of the series, is a complex political subplot, where the political class of the wizarding world go through the stages of denial, fear, and suspicion when faced with an existential threat to their way of life. This political subplot mirrors many of the themes found commonly in societies experiencing rising fascism and political polarization. In Order of the Phoenix, the Minister for Magic outright denies Voldemort's return entirely. He then uses his influence at the Daily Prophet, the wizarding world's only source of news, to publicly discredit Harry and Dumbledore and call them liars. He then has Dolores Umbridge act as an agent of censorship at Hogwarts, editing the school curriculum to suit the political stance of the Ministry and recruiting students to inform on their classmates. Later, once the Ministry has been taken over by Voldemort from the inside, an extreme mantra of race purity arises, and opportunists such as bounty hunters and informants clamour for rewards and newfound status in this climate of fear and suspicion. the Ministry holds what are essentially sham trials, accusing Muggle-born witches and wizards of stealing wands from real witches and wizards. These plot points all build the series' allegory of fascism and rising authoritarianism, but they're very cleverly signposted in the film's production design. In Deathly Hallows Part 1, we see a new police force of sorts wearing quite severe military-style uniforms. These uniforms are very alike to military and police uniforms of the 1930s and 40s, in particular Nazi uniforms. The anti-mudblood propaganda leaflets also reference fascist design, with a pink twist to visually associate them with the character Dolores Umbridge. But I think the most interesting example of fascist aesthetics in these films is the design of the statue in the Ministry atrium. Originally, the Ministry atrium was home to two enormous gold-plated statues, but after Voldemort's takeover of the Ministry, these sculptures are replaced with a singular obelisk crushing a mass of bodies. As Hermione reveals, these figures are muggles in their rightful place. The title of the sculpture is Magic is Might. This disturbing sculpture is very much in the style of early 20th century fascist architecture, as well as generally 1930s sculpture. Some examples of this style can be seen in Italy from the Mussolini era, and also in Soviet sculpture from the mid-20th century. These authoritarian aesthetics of the 20th century may not be obvious to most viewers, but they do visually trigger an association of ideas of severity, oppression, and oligarchy. Like their historical counterparts, these designs imply a radical push towards an authoritarian future, one that promises power and prosperity to those deemed worthy and pure, but harsh punishment to those who disobey the regime. Now, it's very easy to read the story of Harry Potter as one of good versus evil, but the grey area of the politics of the Ministry of Magic shows us a much more complex political sphere than we might originally see. And also, taking a closer look at the aesthetics of the good guys might reveal some uncomfortable truths. A good place to start is to jump back to the aesthetic of the Neo-Gothic. Interestingly, the Neo-Gothic was actually a reaction to another popular movement of the 19th century, the Neoclassical. Now, the Neoclassical style, which revived the aesthetics of the ancient Greeks and Romans, was often associated with republicanism and liberalism. The Neo-Gothic reaction to the Neoclassical was fueled in part by a rising Catholic evangelicalism and a pro-monarchy ideology. Quite a conservative ideology at a time when Europe was pushing further towards democracy, industrialization, and the idea of the separation between church and state. The problem with 19th century Neo-Gothic is that it's built on false historical nostalgia. And like all aesthetics, the Neo-Gothic has a political agenda. And it's this political agenda that's used in the Harry Potter series to give Hogwarts its sense of grandeur, status, and importance. Hogwarts is essentially an elite private school run by a headmaster and a board of governors. We know from the second film that the board of governors includes members from high-status families like the Malfoys, and we know that there is tension between Dumbledore and the Ministry of Magic over who should have influence and control over students' education. Now, the story frames the Ministry as the bad guys in these situations, which is definitely valid in the case of Umbridge, but never questions why one man should have so much power in such an important institution. The nostalgic and mystical atmosphere of Hogwarts means that we never question why Dumbledore's total power is acceptable, but the Ministry's oligarchy or Voldemort's authoritarianism isn't. While we're on the topic of institutions, I've already covered how the aesthetic of fascism takes over the Ministry in the final films of the series, but I think we should also have a look at the aesthetics of the Ministry pre-Voldemort's rise to power. The first thing that strikes you when you see the Ministry are these glossy dark green tiles that cover every surface of the building. These were inspired by London Underground railway station tiles, many from the late 19th and early 20th century, which makes total sense because the Ministry of Magic is literally an underground institution. But there is another key 19th century design in the Ministry. I've already discussed the Magic is Might sculpture from Deathly Hallows, but let's take a closer look at the sculptures it replaced. The misleadingly titled Fountain of Magical Brethren shows a witch, a wizard, a centaur, a goblin, and a house elf. all apparently in cooperation and harmony with one another, although the wizard is clearly meant to be the centre of attention. This type of sculpture is highly reminiscent of the ways that the 19th century British Empire glorified its rule and power with public monuments. Public monuments are a tool for narrative building, and in most cases, a tool for the state to impose its often glorified and sanitized version of its own history onto its people. In recent months, we've seen what happens to monuments that glorify men whose actions are no longer deemed admirable. For the Ministry, this image glosses over the reality of magical relations that the rest of the story reveals to us. The centaurs are not cooperating with the Ministry, as they're having their land and their rights restricted. The goblins are rightfully mistrustful of wizards who try to rip them off, and the house elves are actually enslaved to the houses that they serve, a plot which is sadly abandoned in the film series. This image of magical harmony that the Ministry would like people to see is in fact a lie. Furthermore, we're made aware that there is a lot of corruption in the Ministry, and not just at the hands of the likes of Lucius Malfoy. Mr. Weasley, who works for the Ministry in the improper use of magic office, spends all his work hours catching people who are illegally modifying muggle objects for magical purposes, yet he himself owns a flying car. And we know from the books that he uses his insider knowledge of the Ministry to avoid getting caught. The difference here is that while Lucius Malfoy's corruption is shown as conniving and evil, Arthur Weasley's is shown as charming and acceptable. All this because the political class of the wizarding world has set up a system where all the players have to cheat. Even among witches and wizards, there is evidence of a certain amount of poverty and class immobility. The prime example, of course, being the Weasley family, who struggle to pay for new clothes and books. Furthermore, although it's never explicitly stated, the night bus, as seen in The Prisoner of Azkaban, appears to be sheltering people experiencing homelessness or sleeping rough. All this reveals an uncomfortable truth. There is a caste system and a class divide in the wizarding world, and it would be there whether Voldemort was around or not. And arguably, Voldemort himself is a product of this class divide. He was essentially an impoverished young man who was radicalized by a mantra of race purity that already existed in the world before him. So why is this relevant? Why have I bothered to make a probably very long by this point and probably rather depressing political analysis of Harry Potter? Well, it matters because symbols, in particular historical symbols, are always being revived, and they're usually being used to tell you a story. Now, the story might be about a boy wizard who goes to magic school, but it might also be a story about your community or your country. It might be a story about what brings people together or what divides them. It might even be a story about power and who deserves it. When historical symbols are revived, it's important to take notice. Recently, particularly in the US, we've seen the revival of symbols like the guillotine of the French Revolution, a bold indicator of the increasing gap between rich and poor, and the anger many people feel towards the ultra-wealthy upper class. The Black Lives Matter movement's removal and destruction of public statues that represent racist and colonial historical figures shows that we know just how powerful historical symbols are, and what it means to either defend or reject them. And at the time of filming this video, it's just before the 2020 US presidential election, and resurgences in fascist imagery and design have been on the rise in the Trump campaign all year. So what solution does the story of Harry Potter offer us? Well, the answer might not be as sugar-coated as you'd hope. After all, the central fantasy of Harry Potter is not magic, but power, and who should wield it. Harry, the protagonist, is a boy who grows up abused and with nothing, only to find out he had magical powers all along. Not only that, but he finds out he was from a wealthy and well-respected family, he has a sizable inheritance, and by his birthright, he will be receiving a first-class education. On the surface, this is a fantasy about self-determination, goodness of heart, and challenging injustices. But it also does a lot of work to solidify institutional grandeur and a false nostalgia for a pre-industrial, pre-democratic Europe. The production design of the Harry Potter films skillfully utilise historical aesthetics to aid the central plot, to characterise the undesirability of muggles, the magic of Hogwarts, and the politics of the Ministry. But these historical aesthetics betray something about the culture that chose them. In today's world, we want nostalgia more than ever before. Sometimes it feels like the world is turning into a total dumpster fire, and we desperately want to escape to another place, somewhere magical and comforting. But it's important to remember that even the comforts of Hogwarts are selling you a particular ideology and a false nostalgia for a non-existent past. Thank you so much for watching this video essay. If you'd like to keep up with me on social media, I'm on Instagram and Twitter, and I make a lot of TikToks, so you can head to the links in the bio. And if you liked this video essay, please give it a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe.